So I'm going to be talking a little bit more about Pharma. So I'll set this book up, I suppose.
Big Pharma, big book.
It is a big book. 263. Federal funding for new diagnostic tools such as colonoscopies, CT scans, mammography. 265. Tagamet became the first drug in history to sell $1 billion in a single year.
Tagamet, I've never heard of that.
Sorry I gave you your spinach, lentil stuff and your Budweiser beans in the jars on the plate. But I figure you might not want to eat it all. And then it's
there we go.
Put it away in the fridge. I didn't know what exactly you wanted, and maybe you wanted a little variety. I gave you some of that because I always eat that, and I don't even know if I've ever let you eat it, and if you like it. Smart Woman tomato soup.
You're saying it's quite hot.
If you really like it, you can have this whole jar too. No, it's not hot at all.
Oh, I like it.
You'll see.
I like the taste of tomato.
A wave of receptor site drugs built up. Statins to lower cholesterol, nucleoside, reverse inhibitors for HIV/AIDS, proton pump inhibitors for gastrointestinal reflux, serotonin reuptake inhibitors for depression. Page 266. Paul Berg developed a gene splicing technique called recombination in 1971. He created a molecule from two different species. Berg's method was used to clone genetically engineered organisms in foreign cells a year later. Recombinant DNA, rDNA, technology was born. Much of the early focus was on E. coli. Page 286. Arthur's cash cow was Roche and the Valium account. Valium added more than 7 million new customers annually, 1975. Roche's benzodiazepines were prescribed 103 million times in 1975, 2 billion plus pills. Marketing wasn't cheap. Roche had set a record 10 million in 1963 for Valium, 400 million for benzo. 40% of the industry's $1 billion were allocated to marketing and promotion. Women on estrogen for 1 to 4 years were 5 to 6 times more likely to get uterine cancer. Page 290. Women taking estrogen for 7 years had a 14 times increased risk to develop cancer. Page 291. Progesterone had shown to provide protection against uterine cancer. 292. Between Premarin and Prempro, Gwyneth Ayers dominated the HRT market. The two drugs accounted for 2/3 of the annual 90 hormone replacement therapy prescriptions. Page 294. Before 100 million Americans started getting polio vaccinations in 1962, 15,000 cases of polio annually, mostly kids. After 3 years of vaccination programs, less than 500 new cases annually.
Wow, that's a significant tick.
Page 295. 1998, Lancet, 12 kids in London hospital for inflamed digestive tract and regressive developmental disorders, autism. 9 kids lost their language skills after getting a combo vaccination for measles, mumps, and rubella. The study wasn't sufficient to come to the conclusion vaccinations cause autism, but this may have been the cause of the modern anti-vaccination movement. Page 297. The Spanish flu killed upward of 100 million people in 1918. 500,000 to 700,000 Americans, over 10 times the number who died in World War II. Swine flu was a close variant of the Spanish flu. No one under age 50 had any natural antibodies. Page 307. Until swine flu, the U.S. produced approximately 80% of the world's annual supply of vaccine. In early 2019, vaccine public crisis, measles outbreaks in several states. Upstate New York County, Rockland, was hit hard and banned unvaccinated kids from public places. More than a dozen drug firms in vaccine research and production abandoned the field, scared regarding liability. By 1993, only 4 American pharma companies remained. There was a vaccine against dengue fever in the Philippines. this is 2015, I think. 3 million children with major health problems made the by French-based Sanofi.
Where is it?
Well, it doesn't.
Okay.
You can't help me with my abbreviations of things.
Okay.
Side effects mimicked the disease, and for those who contracted dengue having had the vaccine, the infection was more virulent. The first lawsuits for this runaway immune reaction were filed in 2019. 308. If a new virus gets identified or reappears, you don't want to jump the gun and assume a pandemic's happening. That was the mantra of infectious disease physicians, research, government health officials at the CDC regarding swine flu response. Swine flu cause for slow response to HIV, ? It's page 309. 311. Belgian nuns were giving pregnant women vitamin shots, ran out of needles, and kept using the same needles. Lassa virus near the Congo River. A few years earlier, tick-borne viral disease had been designated Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever. Ebola, named after Ebola River, meaning Black River, passed by sex and blood. Page 320. Werner Thiel, Hemo-Caribbean. I don't know what I was writing there. That doesn't make any sense. Caribbean's technical director. Don't know what that was. You can look on page 320. Said they rejected 1 to 2% of its 6,000 donors. Too little hemoglobin, too weak. Phil didn't worry about disease screening since Haiti, this is a quote, Haiti has no drug addict problem, and most active blood sellers in the U.S. are drug addicts, many of whom have hepatitis. Phil claimed they had a unique freezing technique that kills bacteria. Wrong. They reuse needles and sometimes catheters. In 1979-1980, a dozen Haitian men were diagnosed with Kaposi sarcoma. A French geologist had blood transfusion due to arm amputation in an accident in Port-au-Prince and developed Kaposi sarcoma 18 months later. Expectant moms started turning up with cytomegalovirus related to herpes. Symptoms: fatigue, fever, swollen lymph glands, vision loss. It turned out to be AIDS. 325. Valium sold 2.3 billion tablets in 1978, was the first drug in history of Pharma to surpass $1 billion in accumulated sales. By 1980, Valium's annual prescriptions fell to 30 million, in half. It was still one of the top 10 selling prescription drugs. It was due to negative publicity regarding health risks. Page 331, the National Institutes of Health micromanaged the lab research it funded. Prior to the mid-1970s, only non-profits were eligible for NIH research grants. Under new management in 1975, NIH didn't tightly oversee research and open funding up to private for-profit companies to apply for research subsidies. Nixon's war on cancer had increased the budget by 1/3, but biotech turned it into the world's largest biomed genetic engineering lab. Its budget went from $1 billion mid-70s to $37 billion in 2019. Faster growth rate than the Defense Department. They offered grants to universities in biotech genetic research, and the schools could patent discoveries and then license patents to pharma firms, so schools got royalties. Page 335. 8,000 pounds of pancreatic glands from pigs necessary to produce a pound of insulin. That's 23,500 animals. 1978, Genentech inserted the human insulin gene into E. coli. The artificially created insulin produced fewer allergic reactions than the animal-based product. 341. Gay men accounted for more than half of all reported cases of gonorrhea and syphilis in the U.S. in 1980. 2/3 of the gay men in San Francisco General Clinic tested positive for Hep B. 20% of the sexually active gay men moving to San Fran contracted Hep in the first 12 months. Within 4 years, the infection rate was virtually 100%. There was no blood bank, virtually. You know I hate it.
Mm-hmm.
There was no blood bank screening for Hep B or HIV. A study in Denver found that gay men had on average, 3 sexual encounters every time they went to a bathhouse. They'd leave the bathhouse with 1/3 odds of getting gonorrhea or syphilis. 1 in 3 chance of getting. In San Fran, there was an 8,000% increase in intestinal parasites over 7 years, mostly in men in their 30s. Medical journals called it gay bowel syndrome. Page 344. Viruses don't have internal growth mechanisms that antibiotics destroy. They cannot survive alone, but live inside human cells and hijack the reproductive mechanisms of those cells. Page 351. In 1987, AZT price increased by 500%. It brought in 1/3 of the company's $425 million profit. AZT itself passed $2 billion in sale by 1994. Pneumonia for end-of-life AIDS patients. 80% of its sales were for off-label treatments of pneumonia. In HIV patients, Lymphomed increased its price by 400% over 2 years. Page 352, the Orphan Drug Act. Government offered incentives, I think this is 1983, to stimulate interest in pharma industries, generous research subsidies, tax credits. The government paid for approximately 70% of the research and development costs for orphan drug projects. The law simplified applying for academic and NIH co-sponsorship, waived processing fees, and expedited FDA approval. Government wanted to encourage pharma to develop meds to treat rare diseases. Page 353. Companies would stack 7-year monopolies for the same drug for indications I don't know, that differ only negligibly. Page 460. Over a decade, drug costs companies selling an opioid product spent $746 million on state and federal lobbying. They spent another $80 million on state and federal candidates. That was split almost equally between Democrat and Republican. Page 470. The Sacklers.
They don't care who's elected so long as they line their pockets.
Yeah. The Sacklers.
That money should be going to research and development. What can I say?
Purdue championed the Global Day Against Pain. It was a World Health Organization sponsored event to make pain relief a basic human right. Canada and Sweden were the first countries to go along. Page 473. Purdue's lawyers said its supervisors and employees, with the intent to defraud or mislead, marketed and promoted OxyContin as less addictive, less subject to abuse and diversion, and less likely to cause tolerance and withdrawal than other pain medications. Purdue was fined $634.5 million. Purdue had $9.6 billion in sales of Oxy in the previous 6 years. The 3 executives got fined. Friedman, $19 million. Udell, $8 million. Goldenheim, $7.5 million. Page 478. The Sacklers approved $7 million in payments to the convicted executives. The largest, $3 million to Michael Friedman. Page 481, the Sacklers voted another $200 million for themselves in 2009. They were informed they violated the corporate integrity agreements, part of 2007 guilty plea. They'd ignored their obligations to oversee the detail team and prevent misrepresentations in the pitches to doctors. The Sacklers' response had been to fire 3 salesmen. They also approved another $162 million in payments to themselves. They then voted to pay the family $173 million. So they were really lining their own pockets. Page 485. FDA officials had estimated that Merck's non-narcotic painkiller had killed 60,000 Americans, more than had died during the Vietnam War. Independent statisticians contended Vioxx might have been responsible for 500,000 deaths by increasing the risk for a lethal heart attack for those patients who were genetically susceptible. Thousands of lawsuits were filed. Merck settled them in 2007 for $4.85 billion, a record at the time. Page 487. In 2011, the Sacklers paid themselves $551 million, a third of $1 billion less than they drew the previous year. The American Pain Foundation, the country's largest nonprofit dedicated to pain management, promoted the idea that opioid painkillers were not the problem, and the fault was over prescribing physicians. Over 90% of its revenue came from opioid manufacturers, with Purdue giving more than double any of its rivals. Page 488, the FDA rejected the application of several manufacturers to approve a generic version of Oxy regarding Purdue's patent expiration. Purdue stopped manufacturing the original and replaced it with its new and improved version with the abuse deterrent coating. That patent protected until 2025 and extended their patent monopoly worth billions of dollars in extra years of profits. Page 492. In 2013, prescription drugs accounted for 20% of American healthcare spending, about $850 per citizen, more than double the average of 19 advanced industrialized nations. U.S. pharmacies dispense the equivalent of 40 tons of pure oxycodone. Americans used 83% of the world's supply. A 30-day supply of OxyContin costs $265 on average. In the U.S., the same prescription averaged $72 in Europe and even less in South America and Asia. U.S. prices for pharmaceuticals were on average 3 times higher than Europe, 6 times higher than Brazil, 16 times higher than India. 493. They've cost more in the U.S. since World War II. 2016 CNBC interview asked why the company's Mylan, best-selling EpiPen, sold for $608 in the U.S. but only $100 to $150 in Europe. We, this is a quote, the U.S., do subsidize the rest of the world, and as a country, we've made a conscious decision to do that, and I think the world's a better place for it, said Mylan CEO Heather Bresch, the daughter of West Virginia's Senator Joe Manchin. Mylan raised the price of EpiPen 15 times since it bought the product's rights in 2007 from a Pfizer subsidiary. Revenues jumped 5-fold from $200 million to $1 billion. EpiPen provided 40% of Mylan's profits, and its margins ballooned from 8% to 55%. And it's a big jump. So I mean, it's funny to see, because you look at it and you go, well, he didn't say that there's that it was a bribe, really, to sell this company for only that much, and then all of a sudden it's worth way more, right? But I mean, guy's a senator, and somehow, right? I mean, it's obvious. So page 494, Merck bought Medco in 1993 for $6.6 billion. Eli Lilly bought PCS for $4.1 billion. SmithKline Beecham spent $2.3 billion. And that's all I'm going to talk about for now, because I think that's probably enough. Oh, I still have lots of time. I may as well go through it. Okay,
Yeah.
page 354, and you're still eating anyway.
And
Gilead's Truvada.
well, I'm not really enjoying hearing all
No,
this
but there's a
corruption
lot of
and so on.
information he's went through. Pre-exposure prophylaxis sought orphan protection in 2019, but they'd gotten FDA approval for it in 2004 for slowing the progression of HIV in those already infected. A San Francisco researcher conducted parallel research with $50 million in federal grants. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation gave $17 million towards their trials. Gilead donated meds. Results: 44% decrease in HIV risk. The U.S. government patented the new use for Truvada in 2015, but Gilead sued to block it since they'd offered the drug free in the trials. The court sided with Gilead. Truvada cost $6 a month to make. Gilead sells it to patients for $1,600 to $2,000 a month, a markup of 25,000%. Gilead's patent doesn't expire in 2021. In under 40 years, America has lost more Americans to HIV than to combat in all of the wars combined. Page 368. By the time Russell Portnoy appeared on Good Morning America in 2010, over 300,000 Americans had died of opioid overdoses in the previous decade, but he assured Americans that addiction when treating pain is distinctly uncommon. Page 372.
Well, we don't know. I mean, they're not actually giving the stats
Yeah.
how many people that died
that way caught the stuff from taking them as legitimate painkillers.
372. Pfizer found that Rivadis, a treatment for pulmonary arterial hypertension, caused erections in 1998. It was approved by the FDA as Viagra. Page 376.
What was it for originally?
I thought that was interesting. Pulmonary arterial hypertension. Yeah.
So theoretically, it's to take blood pressure down. Okay.
Oh, but anyway, 376. A 10-year study found that 80% of the top 100 best-selling drugs had gotten at least one patent extension by using a new and improved application. More than half had multiple extensions. Page 395. Bristol earned hundreds of millions from Taxol cancer drug, while it kept the copycat drugs tied up in courts for $20 to $25 million in legal costs. Brand manufacturers pay generic companies to delay their drugs release. Page 403. Raymond Sackler's sons, Richard and Jonathan, and two of Mortimer's daughters, Kathy and Eileen, became Purdue Pharma directors. Raymond's wife, Beverly, Mortimer's third wife, Teresa, and Mortimer Jr. joined the board. 1989. Oxy-based drug, OxyContin, coating for control release prevented addicts from getting high. Page 417. Purdue's production costs across the board were virtually the same since oxycodone, the active ingredient, was cheap to manufacture. However, it charged more for each higher strength. Page 420. When someone bypassed the extended release shell, 70% of the oxycodone, as opposed to the time release, 10%, went straight to the brain. That produced a euphoric high that rivaled heroin. Sales, $48 million in 1996 to $1.1 billion in 2000. Purdue's detail team was earning over $40 million in year-end bonuses. Page 425. The FDA in 1982 budget was $329 million. Prescription drug sales in America topped $15 billion annually. Page 433. Merck's Vioxx became a $2 billion a year pill until the FDA ordered a mandatory recall. Merck pulled it just before the recall. And yeah, it's funny because Vioxx, that was something that my grandma had been prescribed, and she had some bad troubles because of it, because she had a heart condition. She had the familial hypercholesterolemia, and she'd had triple bypass and stuff. Boy, did she ever, that really did her a number, getting on Vioxx. And doctors were pushing that like crazy. Like, they got me on it. And it didn't work for me, so I went off of it, but it was useless. They were giving it to everyone.
Useful for lining their pockets.
Yeah.
That
Page
seems to be the theme
435.
of this.
Yes. Purdue had targeted poverty-scarred working-class whites in rural America as the prime market for OxyContin. Page 437. MS Contin surpassed heroin as Cincinnati's most abused opioid in 1990. Page 440. 2 years after the FDA had approved OxyContin, it approved Cephalon's antique fentanyl lollipop. Fentanyl lollipop.
When was that?
This was the first I'd heard of this.
Yeah.
Like, what kind of crazy is that? I'll talk about it. For cancer patients, fentanyl patches and antique, I don't know what it was called, pops, had been diverted for profit. 2001, $1.45 billion in revenue, OxyContin. 2002, $1.59 billion in sales, 80% of Purdue's business. Page 450, the top 10 pharma company in the Fortune 500 had more combo profits than the other 490 companies. In OxyContin's first full year, in 1997, doctors wrote 920,000 prescriptions. In 2002, it ballooned to 77.2 million. Only 1 million were for cancer-related pain. Nearly half the drug's prescribers were primary care doctors. Page 451, marketing files show that 75% of the $400 million Purdue spent promoting OxyContin came after 2000. That's the year congressional testimony. That's the year that executives from the company later claimed in congressional testimony that they first learned of reports about the drug's abuse. Page 460, the Sacklers were increasing their own contributions to politicians, 3.3 million since 1996 to over 300 candidates and political groups. For diversified pharmaceutical services, Bristol-Myers Squibb formed an alliance with Caremark, and Pfizer did the same with Value RX. Page 494, pharmacy benefit managers covered half all insured Americans in 1999. Clinton's drug plan paid half of the first $5,000 in medication costs and 100% of everything over that, as opposed to extensive government control in the administration's 1993 proposal. PBMs would manage the new one. Approved in George W. Bush's administration, it was called the Medicare Prescription Drug Improvement and Modernization Act. Page 495, the law went into effect in 2006. Drug benefits were extended to all seniors for the first time in America. Drugs were available to tens of millions of patients without a price cap mandatory by government. Rebates equals conflict of interest. Pay for listing system serves as an incentive for pharma to increase list prices so it can offer larger rebates to the pharma supply chain. There are no requirements for public transparency, nor do they have any legal obligation to disclose to anybody the rebates they receive from pharma companies. PBMs don't use those rebates to offset retail drug prices or lower the cost of patient insurance premiums. Pharma rebates to PBMs increase the average cost on many popular medications by about a third. A gag clause prevents pharmacists from telling patients if there's a comparable and cheaper drug available. In 2018, President Trump signed 2 bills passed by Congress that were supposed to eliminate the gag clause. Now patients have to ask, but pharmacists are required to pharmacists aren't required to inform patients automatically. Before Obama's 2010 Affordable Care Act, medical coverage covered drugs for Americans, Medicaid covered at or below the poverty line, $31,721 for a family of 4. The ACA increased eligibility by raising the income level to 133% of the poverty line, increasing the number eligible for Medicaid by $10 million. Total eligible 71.2 million. Page 496, the federal government's legally required in all its drug benefit programs to cover every FDA approval drug, whether the prescription was written for a generic or an exorbitantly priced biologic. This increased pharma industry revenues and profits. The Medicaid alone, drug spending rose over 2 years by 25% to $4 billion. More than 90% of the Medicaid's drug expenditures by 2015 were for brand names instead of generics. Page 497, 2006 Medicare's prescription plan went into effect between then and 2010. Medicare's spending on prescription meds ranged between 2 to 5% of the total U.S. spending on drugs. After the ACA, from 2011 to 2017, Medicare's share of all the national expenditures on prescriptions soared to 30%. When Medicaid and other government drug benefit programs were included, the federal government pays a remarkable 45% annually of all the retail prescription costs in the United States. There had been only $8 billion selling drugs in the industry before $2,000. Since then, there's been more than 100, with a few